Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are, and thank you for joining today's webinar, the latest updates in the Sage Intacct 2017 Release 3. I'm Megan Turco, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we jump in, I'm going to briefly go over how to use the webinar console. The orange arrow on the right side of your screen will let you toggle the control tray open or closed. And at the bottom of that control tray, you'll see a chat window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout the webinar via the chat function, and we will get to as many of them as we can towards the end of the webinar. On your GoToWebinar console, you should see an area for audio settings. If you're calling in through your telephone, please choose the Use Telephone option. And alternatively, if you're using your computer speakers, please select the Use Mic and Speakers option instead. Additionally, I do want to note that today's webinar is being recorded. We'll send out the slides as well as a link to the on-demand recording of the webinar within about 48 hours, so definitely keep an eye out for that message if you're interested in accessing the webinar after today or sharing it with any of your colleagues who couldn't make it to the webinar live this morning. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's presenters. First up, we have Manesh Patel, who is a manager on Armanino's Sage Intacct team. He's got experience working on over 100 Sage Intacct implementations and is a certified Sage Intacct implementation consultant. Prior to joining our firm here at Armanino, Manesh has held multiple positions in public accounting and cloud solutions startups. He's got a lot of experience leading system implementations to achieve and automate business processes around accounting, budgeting, forecasting, and fixed assets. Next up, we have Brenda Kaler, who has over 15 years of accounting experience, primarily with nonprofits in Big Four public accounting and in-house as a controller herself. So she's got a lot of the experience that a lot of you on our webinar here today also have. Prior to joining Armanino, she led Sage Intacct implementation as an Armanino accountant for a 50 million nonprofit and has extensive knowledge of nonprofit accounting and compliance requirements. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Brenda, to kick us off for today.
Excellent. Can you hear me all right?
Yep, coming in good.
All right, great. So today our agenda, we're going to go through the Release 3 notes, and we're going to go in this order: contracts, projects, accounts payable, inventory, some general workflow updates, reporting, an update on the Salesforce integration V2, and then other enhancements, some small tweaks they've made that didn't fall into any of these other categories. So with that, we're going to kick it off, and I'm going to hand it over to Manesh to start contracts.
Awesome. Thank you, Brenda. So as we've been noticing the trend with respect to the contracts module, this latest release has several different refinements to contracts based upon both feedback received as well as what's been kind of in the pipeline or the roadmap in terms of updates. So looking forward to kind of going through these with you. So first up is one invoice to rule them all. So if we're all familiar, or if you've got the projects module in Intacct, you may be familiar with project rebilling. So the whole benefit, or one of the key benefits of that module, is a billing engine that allows you to tag projects across various types of transactions: purchasing, AP, employee expenses, and timesheets, and allow you to bill for that through that billing engine. So there's this whole billing engine that allows you to consolidate your invoicing all kind of in one invoice. And so historically, if you've had AP bills where you are expecting payments from your customers for some of the costs that you've endured, as well as a time materials project for timesheets, that billing engine has been used for that. So where contracts comes in is it's kind of married itself with the project billing module. And so as you can see, you've got two additional types of transactions that can now be generated with one single invoice. So that's a fixed fee contract billing as well as the usage charges. As you know as well, tagging the project is very critical. So in this case, any transactions where you've tagged the contract, you would also want to tag the project, and then you'd get a similar experience. So this next slide just kind of shows you what that filter or preview option looks like before you go in and run that or generate all those invoices. Now, there's a bunch of new options in here. So filters, you can filter on a variety of dimensions, a bunch of criteria. You can run an invoice run record, so it's kind of similar to the projects module where you can view the invoice run, see what the requests look like during the processing, and see whether there was any failures or any successes with that. You can also go in and preview the snapshot, so this is really, really helpful, right? Going in and being able to preview what you're going to bill prior to actually billing it. And then that also extends itself to just reviewing that invoice. The other piece of this as well is you can filter this screen for transactions that you'd like to include. So if there was no AP or purchasing that was specific for this whole generation of invoice run, then you can go in and exclude those, so your list goes actually a little bit lower. So kind of keeping up with that theme, you have the benefit of contracts and projects being married together. And with that unification, if you're familiar and you've got the projects module for any kind of revenue recognition, contracts actually marries itself to that piece as well. So now you can post RevRec on both contract line items and the project associated with that, all kind of in one page. So an example is, let's just say you're recognizing revenue off of hours based upon the project. Well, now that little as of date that shows 7/31, that's going to be able to keep track of when, let's just say, you pulled in the hours as of that particular date to actually post the revenue. So very nice kind of marrying feature, not just on the billing side, but also on the RevRec side as well. This is also another feature where contracts and projects kind of goes hand in hand. So the system can actually go in and calculate and schedule adjustments. So this is, I mean, very typical with any kind of project accounting clients, right? You'll have a timesheet that gets entered for a certain period, and outside of that period, there might be an adjustment to that timesheet. So typically, that employee is going to go in and put in an adjusting timesheet to make that correction in terms of the hours. Now, what you can have the system do is post that adjustment to the RevRec in that period, if that period is open, or post it to the following period. So in this case, if there was January that was open and you had this adjustment that needed to be made, then it would post in January. But if you had closed the month of January, then it would then post in February. So that's with respect to the kind of the late and changed timesheets. This marrying itself also kind of extends itself to billing pricing tiers, like improvements. And I'll show you an example of how it looked before and then how it's going to look after this particular release. But let's just say that we needed to keep track of different prices for different units at different quantities. Well, prior to this release, at the time of actually billing it, it actually grouped it all together. So if I had a certain tier of items that were sold at X price and another tier of items that were sold at Y price, at the time of looking at the billing, it all be consolidated in one. And so now you have the ability to kind of go in and split the invoice lines. So this example shows you that we're about to sell some widgets. So anything from 0 through 20 widgets, we're going to charge $10 a widget. And then anything 21 and over, we're going to go in and charge $8. So that's kind of the example of what tiered pricing exists with lots of our clients. Now, if we were to go in and do it when the option was not enabled, this first screenshot up top shows you the default behavior. So it's going to show you for 25 widgets, we're going to get charged the 0 to 20 rate, which is $200, and then the 5 times 8 rate, which is above the 21 tier, so $240 together. When we do have the option enabled, we get a little bit more granularity on the bottom. So you've got the $200 times the 10 widgets is $200, and then tier 2, very clearly shown in the price calculation memo, an extra $40 for the $8 tier for anything above 20. So nice update with some of those some of those areas. Intacct also introduced the ability to kind of bend the revenue as well as expense amortization schedules at the time of recognizing revenue. So this is kind of another area where you might have some revenue or expense templates that are mapped for a certain period, and you want to amortize that over that period, but you would like to go in and have a little bit more control over the way that the posting is actually scheduled. So this little example here kind of shows you that we've got, let's just say we have $10,000 for some training classes that are going to be scheduled, and to recognize those training classes as they are happening, we've got 30%, 30%, and 40% to get us to the 100% to recognize the whole amount of revenue. So it might look like this as follows for the revenue template, and then when we actually go in and see the revenue schedule in Intacct, you'll see that 30%, 30%, and 40%. So you kind of have a little bit more flexibility around these predefined percentage methods, whereas that didn't exist before. And that same concept exists with expense amortizations as well. Also, there is a small feature, but it's very, very helpful, and you probably have seen this in terms of whenever you're clicking more actions, there's always new updates like audit trails and all these other things coming out. But at the time of actually generating the invoices in the preview screen, you can actually look at your billing data before you actually go in and create the invoices. So that little preview snapshot when you click more actions will show you a snapshot as of a point in time, and you can actually go and give it a name. So that was not available before, and actually hasn't really been available in the project billing engine either. In project billing, you can just go in and preview, kind of in this screen, preview what you're about to bill. This now gives you the ability to go and look at a snapshot. So it's kind of a snapshot in the form of a report that shows you what you're going to bill. Additional enhancements, so as Brenda was mentioning, there's a little section on the bottom that had some additional areas that were not covered. So contracts had a few of them where you can change, you can change the state of a contract. So that was a quick update that they made. If you've got multiple element arrangements, like you're keeping track of the effective dates for those, now you can go in and modify that. And then also that date validation off of those revenue and expense amortization templates, you can go in and modify dates as well. So nice updates to see that. For the past few releases, contracts has been a big area of focus. So once again, this is just kind of additional refinements. Projects, I'm going to hand it back over to Brenda.
Thanks, Manesh. So we talked a lot about the contracts and projects marriage. So Intacct has been investing a lot of time and effort into both of these areas in the last several releases, as we've seen here. So in addition to the marriage of contracts and projects, we have a bunch of additions to timekeeping, actually. It's been a while since they've updated this area. They've mostly focused on the expenses, so it's nice to see these updates in this release here. So the first one is that you can now validate timesheet entry against the resource start date. So in the last release, they released it to be able to enforce project end dates. So it required all expenses, all time booked to the project to be equal to or prior to the end date of the project, which allowed you to close down the project in a timely basis. So now, furthering that and giving you a little bit more control, they've also allowed you to ensure that all time booked to the project is equal to or after the start date. So these are, you can see here in the configure projects, these are separate permissions, so you can enable one and not the other depending on how your organization is using your timesheets. The other update that I'm real excited about is the ability on the approved timesheet screen to see billable and non-billable time summarized. So they've added the billable quantity and the non-billable quantity field directly to that view list. The nice thing about that is that since it is on this view here, you can also pull it into custom views now. So you can create custom reports or pull that into other metrics that you might be running for your organization. And then the last update to the timekeeping here is that they have increased the flexibility when entering days instead of hours into timesheets. So previously, all of those, the number of hours per day had to be a whole number. So now they have released the ability to have that be a decimal. So in case you have any non-chargeable time, you can make your total billable for the day 7.2 as the requirement to leave, 0.8 for that non-billable time. So that's a welcome enhancement as well. Okay, and they've been marrying projects to everybody lately, and this update is about improved functionality between projects and the spend management function. So spend management, as some of you may be aware, is an add-on to the purchasing module that allows you to validate the budget prior to entering in a purchase requisition or order into that kind of combination of dimensions. So now, where you are validating against project, you are now able to check the box, you can see it down the bottom of the screen here, to use the project begin and end date. So those of you that are using projects, nonprofits that are using projects for grants, this allows you to enforce your period of availability. And if you're using projects for other items as a professional services to track all your different clients and projects, that's also important to make sure that you're ending your projects on time or that you're managing and pushing out those end dates. So once you select project as a dimension that you're going to validate against in your spend management setup, you can check that box. And now, instead of looking to necessarily the budget period, which is usually going to be done in months, quarters, or years, you can actually look to the project period, which sometimes is going to be starting mid-month, ending mid-month, or might be 3 years, in which case you're really managing to that overall project budget, not necessarily the unique time frame of itself. So again, another welcome enhancement. Okay, accounts payable. So this is an area that Intacct has really been kind of holding out for us and promising us it was on the way. You may have heard them talk about the AP Workbench if you've attended any of the recent customer meetups or if you were at Advantage last year. They talked a lot about the AP Workbench. Well, it's here and we're real excited about it. So the first thing I wanted to mention about the AP Workbench is that this is only available in the new UI. So if you have not yet switched off and toggled into the beta UI, it's available at the top of your home screen there, and it is a link, and you can toggle back and forth. It's done per user. You can maybe do all your accounts payable in the new UI and then switch back into the old one to do your accounts receivable or your general ledger posting. Very fluid. The screens do look a little bit different. And the AP Workbench, the permissions to the AP Workbench, if you have select bills to pay permissions in the old UI, you will automatically have permissions to the new AP Workbench. And what you're going to see on the workflow under activities for the AP Workbench is called pay bills. So they didn't call it AP Workbench in the actual system. It's called pay bills. And what that does is it gives you kind of a command center for your bills. So it allows you to have an outbox so that if you have multiple AP people that are located in different places, or if you have AP people that have different responsibilities, maybe one person does your check run and one person does all your ACH transfers, this allows them to kind of group bills in different ways depending on the payment method. So if you wanted to do one via check run, one via record transfer, you can group those and not release them for the approval. If you have the approval on, once you select the bills to pay, they automatically go for approval. So this allows you to hold them as a group, keep adding things to it as you're entering in your bills, and then release them all to pay all as once, which might be preferable to any of you that have the approvals on, so that you can get those to your approver in one lump sum as opposed to kind of doing it piecemeal as you get each item. So if you are an admin and you have access to the accounts payable area, you will be able to see your outbox as well as everybody else's outbox. So if I had somebody, I could see mine. I could also see my AP staff, or there's also an option to see all outboxes at once. And that can be convenient if you've got multiple people, or if somebody had a check run half in process and then called in sick on check run day. You can go in as the admin and complete the check run by going into their outbox and releasing those for the workflow. So really nice to finally see this, and it gives you a lot of flexibility. So one of the other flexible things in the AP workbench that we've been asking for a long time is a much easier way to apply credits in line. So how Intacct, you may or may not have noticed that if you have a credit or a debit memo, as the case may be, to apply against an AP invoice, when you apply that credit, if you have multiple lines in the bill, what Intacct would do is it would pro rata spread that credit to each line item that's in the invoice. For a lot of organizations, that was fine, but most people needed to apply the credit to a specific line item, especially for those of you that have both services as well as software, or that are selling different types of things. You want to make sure you apply the credit to the correct line item. And it was really difficult. You had to go through 2 different screens, and it was a little complicated in the old Select Bills to Pay to split that credit onto the correct line. They've made it really easy for you in this workbench. So now what the system will automatically do, and it is a configuration setting, is to enable the auto application of inline credits. And when you enable this setting under accounts payable, what it will do is it will automatically apply the credit starting with the first line until it's used up. So if you have a $5,000 credit, line 1 is $2,000, it will credit that line, then it'll go on to line 2. Line 2 is $3,000, it uses up the rest of that $5,000 credit. So this is important to understand for those people that are going to be entering in the AP bills. If you know that you always apply your credits to your services and not to the software, you'll definitely want to make sure that that's how you enter in the AP bill, to put the services in first so that you can take advantage of that auto application. The other thing for those of you that are operating in a multi-entity environment, and even for those of you operating in a multi-location environment, now in the multi-entity configuration, you have the option in the new UI only to limit the AP credits to entity owners. So if you have a credit that was given for location 100, and then you have an invoice for location 200, it would not automatically apply that credit. It will not be available for location 200. It would only be available for location 100. So similarly, if you had multiple invoices for multiple locations available for that vendor, when you select it, it would automatically match up to the oldest invoice that was for that location. That will hopefully allow you to better match up your credits and hopefully reduce any intercompany transfers resulting from the way that Intacct formally applied the credits. And then the last update on here is for the payment request. So when you are looking at your payment request activity in the new UI, it now really clearly calls out which bills are being paid and which credits are being applied in 2 different sections. So it was really nice to see kind of the streamlined visual of what you're paying in that particular check run there. All right, and with that, I'm going to pass it back to you, Manesh, for inventory.
Awesome, yeah. And exactly as Brenda mentioned, this AP Workbench is definitely worth your exploration. We've been hearing a lot about it. I was actually just at the San Jose meetup with Intacct customers, and this was kind of the main topic. So So next up is inventory. In the last release, if we all recall, I had actually mentioned that there was the ability to promote warehouse transfers between warehouses within the same entity. So if you're operating in a multi-entity shared environment, which I would say a majority of our clients are, you can now do warehouse transfers between entities. So of course this is one of those activities that you do at the top level, and it works exactly the same way as the previous functionality of transferring warehouses between one entity, except that there's some additional accounting that happens because we're crossing entities. So really that debit to inventory from a warehouse being the transfer in is going to impact intercompany, whether it's a payable or receivable account for the other entity at which you're transferring. So very, very similar if you've done journal entries at the top level where you've grabbed a source entity and then you've crossed the entities in the line items where it generates that intercompany for you. Very, very similar where we do have that impact to intercompany when we're transferring inventory between different sets of warehouses. This is just kind of an example further that just demonstrates what those debits and credits are, where we've got a target entity, what the credit is for the target entity, we've got a debit to the entity or the warehouse that it's actually going to, and just shows you what those receivable and payable accounts are. So another area which we've always kind of not like shied away from, but not necessarily Intacct hasn't very much supported, is the serial numbers. So now there's lots of ways to go in and put in serial numbers for your inventory. And so that first one is where you get the ability to add serial numbers to transactions with no inventory effect. So it gives you more flexibility than what was previously there, where you can actually have transactions that are affecting that have serial numbers associated with them but not actually impact inventory. And then that warehouse transfer to move items with serial numbers, that's the same functionality that I just reviewed, but now we can do that all in one transaction. Inventory with serial numbers will be moving from one warehouse to another warehouse. There's also the ability to go in and run a report, the serial tracking report. It's just going to go in and it was just cleaned up a bit where decreases to inventory are now shown as negative numbers. So they're displayed just that PO receiver shows that we received one. We shipped out some inventory that we actually sold. So it was the same item, that Dell monitor. So now we have 0 for that particular item ID B002. So nice to be able to kind of see some updates like that. The next one here is with respect to kits. So if we are managing or kitting our items together, and that's a concept where we're going in and grabbing several different types of items and associating them with a kit, there's now a kit report that allows you to display those components. And it's just this report here is pulling from the custom report wizard, and it's pulling an object, and I'll review this when we talk about some of the reporting enhancements a bit later in this deck. But this kit report is actually a data source where you can pick and choose as to what you actually want to show. But the key benefit is it's going to show me for these 4 kits what items are in there, what is my cost method for them, is it standard cost, what is the transaction activity happening within this kit, so on and so forth. So it's nice to be able to do that. And Custom Report Wizard is accessible in customization services or platform services. And that data source is just like the many, many data sources that exist right now in that Custom Report Wizard, where you can go and select this kit one. This is a nice update as well for inventory. So let's talk about prior to this release. Let's just say you had some non-inventory items as the item type that exists, and now inventory comes into play. Well, what we would previously recommend is inactivating those items and adding a new item. Unfortunately, because the item type is locked in, you can't actually change the item type. And so now through a CSV import template, you can update the item type. So if you did have an item marked as non-inventory or non-inventory purchase only or non-inventory sales only, you see how you can go in and update that to be inventory. And so this is something that's in, it's a functionality or option within inventory control. So if you're subscribed to that, then we can go in, or you can go in, grab the template and upload it there and be able to essentially move your inventory from one item type to another item type. So it just kind of gets rid of the hassle of not being able to edit something that wasn't editable before. Workflow, back to Brenda.
All right. So workflow is what I usually normally refer to as kind of ease of use enhancements. So this is actually a really awesome one, purchasing approvals. So now, previously, employee users could only approve a purchase requisition. They could not have any approval roles on purchase orders or vendor invoices. So now they are able to approve purchase requisitions or requests, purchase orders, and vendor invoices. Caveat, they cannot create purchase orders or vendor invoices, only approve. And as just a kind of a functionality reminder, if users have any restrictions on their user record, either entity, location, or department, they cannot be named approvers, although they can be employee manager kind of workflow approvers. So this is a nice enhancement to open up that to more flexibility depending on what your purchasing scenario is. And then the other one is increasing their visibility to Spend Insight. So Intacct has been doing updates to this add-on module periodically for about the last year, I'd say. We've seen some pretty heavy updates in here. So previously, the Spend Insight was available to the person that was submitting the purchase request, but it was not available to the approver. So everybody was like, well, the approver also needs to know, because if you only have it set on warn and not as disallow, the approver also needs to know that this is going to go over budget before they approve it. That's definitely some necessary information. So you can see here in this grayed out area, we've got Show Spend Insight is now available right above the transaction grid when you're looking at a purchase order as an approver. And when you click that, you get this pop-out here that shows you the Spend Insight. This will show all of the dimensions that you have indicated you are validating against on your budget. And it shows your budget, your actual, what this expense is for, whether or not it's going to post, and then what your funds available on this line item are going to be after this is posted. So that's a really nice enhancement. So there are two other updates to Spend Insight. The first one is that previously you could only do GL groups for income statement accounts, but they have now expanded that to balance sheet accounts. So if you do have a capital budget and you want to enforce your budget management and spending through the purchasing module, that's now available for you. And kind of hand in hand with that, previously you were limited to 175 expenditure item GL groups, and with this release they have now removed that restriction, so there is no limit to how many expenditure items that you can have. All right, and reporting, back to you, Manesh.
Awesome. Yeah, this is a really good update. I'm actually going, this past week, I've been going back to some of my clients and saying, hey, this is a new feature, go and run this report, because it wasn't available prior to this release. So not that the custom report wizard is already confusing. I'm sure to many it is, because there's so many different data sources to choose from. But there's a new data source yet again that was introduced that allows you to do subtotal breakdown. So prior to this release, breaking down some of those subtotals was like you would only get to see the subtotal per transaction. You wouldn't get to see a breakdown of that subtotal, because that subtotal can include more than just one attribute. As you can see in the screenshot, you've got discount, sales taxes, and shipping. So now we have the ability to have a description and have it further broken down. So that object or that data source is called order entry transaction subtotals. And I know to many of our clients that custom report wizard is just it's too much to choose from, and there's not a manual as to what each data source actually means. But this one goes in, and if you go and explore this and you go to that second step, you'll be able to see the various other areas like this description that you can go in and make another report for. So I've got many different clients using order entry and subtotals within order entry that wanted to get a little bit more insight into what made up that particular subtotal. So this is what this is the data source that allows that to happen. I think I mentioned this with that kit report in inventory, but like I had mentioned, there is a new data source for this kit costing report, and you don't have to create your report like the one that I showed. You can actually go in and modify and show various other objects. So as you can see, kit costing is a new data source. You can select from anything in the kit costing, and then you've got all these sub data sources, aisle, bin, row, inventory control. All those are sub data sources to the primary data source. So one of the confusing attributes with this wizard is, you always had to go in and dig into the detail, and sometimes you might have sub data sources. But as long as you understand that it's all connected to one big data source or one component, then it makes it easier. And there will be a new look coming pretty soon for the custom report wizard. So for now, if we're designing reports, these are two new sources that you can add. So the Salesforce integration was a big news in the last release, and even started from the release prior to that. As you all know, there is a new connector. So that was created in order to connect Intacct with Salesforce's new Lightning interface. So it just so happens that the accounting system is also taking a little aesthetic facelift with respect to a new UI, just like Salesforce is. So that new connector has been introduced, and now we are only implementing that new connector. Well, there are some areas where functionality needed to get improved because either feedback was being received, or there were kind of a few gaps that existed. So there's some extended functionality around departments and exchange rate types if you're multi-currency, project types and territories. Territories are attributes to customers. There's a bi-directional sync of any kind of custom fields that you've mapped on the contact and account records. So that is new and exists. If you've got the digital board book and you want to keep track of different change types or fields like none or initial monthly recurring revenue and add-on monthly recurring revenue, those are just fields that have been updated. There's a whole list here, and I know without getting too wordy, it is pretty important, but we do have this sync with Intacct checkbox. So basically now records can either sync in bulk, or that little checkbox will allow information to go from one system to the other. There's also a report that goes and says, hey, what actually failed? Why did it fail to actually sync? And then there's some enhancements or updates to the Salesforce admins in terms of subscriptions. This one all the way at the bottom was critical. We've got so many different clients that are going live with this connector, and they needed the ability to map custom fields on order entry transaction definitions, just like the normal or the first version of the connector did. So if I have an order entry transaction, like a sales order, where I'm keeping track of some additional billing notes, or shipping notes, or anything through a custom field, that field mapping is now updated between the two sets of systems. So, you'll get a copy of this deck and you'll see it in the recording, but nice to be able to see some refinements based upon some feedback that that Intacct has had. Back to Brenda here for other enhancements.
So just one add to the Salesforce connector. This is the Intacct Salesforce connector. If you are using the Armanino nonprofit Salesforce connector, or if you have a custom connector, this would not apply to you. So just a call out there on that. One other call out before we jump into the other enhancements. We're seeing some questions come in. We'll answer them all at the end. If you have any other questions that come up that you would like answered, please go ahead and enter them into either the chat or the questions box. And everybody will receive a copy of this presentation within a week of us ending it. Usually it's much sooner than that, but we promise a week. Okay, so other enhancements. So normally I wouldn't mention new terminology in the webinar, but I thought this was important to call out, especially with this day and age and all of the data breaches we see in the news and things like that. You do want to make sure that your system data is protected from anybody fraudulently accessing it. So two-step verification is enabled for everybody in Intacct. You are unable to disable it. You do have to use it. So they've cleaned up some of the terminology in here, from old terminology to the new terminology. You can see all the things they've changed. And what I really think they've done is they've made this really technical kind of IT words more user-friendly for the accounting department. So I think they've cleaned up some of this to actually make it really clear what you're doing and how you're utilizing these items here. I'm not going to go through it, but I did want to call it out here. So there you go. Web services, a number of updates to web services. Most of these are related to other things that we've discussed throughout this webinar as part of the release. So there are new AP payment objects. So this is related to the new AP Workbench, related to the pay bills functionality in the new UI. So there are a couple of new AP payment objects that you can now use through the API and do things there. The Get Account Balance and Get Trial Balance API functions now support the dimension and reporting book features. So those reports through the user interface, if you're running those reports themselves, also include dimension and reporting book filters natively in the UI. So now they've upgraded the API to also have those filters available for you. As Manesh discussed in the inventory update, you can now move inventory from one warehouse to another using the intercompany transfers. So they have also created an API object, so you can do those kinds of transfers through the API as well. The Get Audit Trail API function, they unveiled the audit trail last year. I believe it was release 4, and they've been making steady improvements to it throughout the year. They don't call it out in most of the releases, but I have noticed that a lot more of the screens are getting that Get Audit Trail underneath the more actions when you're looking at various transaction type things. So now it allows you to provide the record number through the API instead of the object key. As any of you who play around with the API may know, that object key changes from module to module, so it was not the best thing to link to for the audit trail purposes. So this now allows you to provide the record number and link to it that way. So as the transaction goes from module to module, it's going to maintain that record number and allow you to follow the trail all the way through. So definitely a great enhancement there. And then the last one, the one that I saved for last because I'm so excited about this. This was actually an idea that I had submitted to Intacct a while ago to allow us to expose the object for attachments in both AP and AR so that clients can now write smart rules and smart events requiring that attachment in the AP and AR modules. I know a lot of you have business processes already in place that the invoice or the bill needs to be attached to those transactions, and now you can write smart rules to enforce it. So even though this is in web services, I think it's going to be applicable to a lot of our clients. Okay, and then other enhancements, couple enhancements to reporting here. So Intacct allows you to do forecasting reports, and previously we were using computation account groups for the financial forecasting reports. So in this release, they have now offered the use of an as of date for a partial month. So because of the calculation required to do an as of, which would be actuals through, let's say, October 4th, and then forecast for the remainder of the month, because of that calculation it needs to do on the back end, you can no longer use computation account groups in any financial forecasting reports that you're doing, because the system is going to basically do that for you, is the understanding there. So that's actually a welcome enhancement there. And then for reporting, like Manesh was mentioning, for the order entry, also applicable to the purchasing transaction detail, there's now a new column for transaction sign. So in addition to the enhancements for the reporting and the subtotaling, you can now have a column for transaction sign. So what that means is you can now show those sales discounts and returns, etc., as negatives on the report. Some of you may have realized or noticed that in a lot of the Intacct financial reports, everything is shown as a positive number, and it's dictated as a plus or a minus in the variance columns, depending on whether it has a natural debit or credit balance on your chart of account setup. So since everything always shows as positive, it can be confusing for non-accounting users when looking at those reports. So being able to control the sign will make this much more user-friendly for those external users outside of the accounting department. This one is probably I should have included this under ease of use, but in print email documents. So this is where you go to print your invoices or to mail them out. The document type that you select to print or email is now sticky. Previously, it used to, when you navigated away, it would always go back and default to the first item in the workflow, and most people are not ever printing anything relating to sales orders or purchasing requisitions. It's not until it's approved and been converted to the next step that you're printing things to share with customers and vendors. So this will make it easier once you choose. You want to always print your invoices, or you always want to print your purchase orders. It will now stay like that, so you won't have to change it every time you go in to do that. Lastly, Action UI, they're continuing to do the beta. There are lots of updates. Every week I'm seeing different things have been improved and moved and changed. So definitely make sure that you are in there checking it out, flipping back and forth, comparing the two. If you would like anybody to walk you through and kind of look at that, the recording for release 2 is up on our website, and I did do a demo and walkthrough of some of the cool new features in the new Action UI. It's at that towards the end of the release webinar, but that is available, or you can definitely reach out to us and we'd be happy to schedule a time with you to show you the highlights. Intacct also has several videos, YouTubes available on their website as well. Definitely keep sending feedback using the Send Us Feedback link. They are listening. I've noticed at least 4 things I've suggested have been taken into account. And those of you using the projects dimension will be happy to hear that it is finally going to be located with all of the other dimensions. In the new UI, they've moved it under the reporting menu. So in addition to appearing under accounts receivable, it will also appear under company. That was one of the big ones that they've done. So little tweaks like that, the more you use it, the more that they will listen to your feedback. So definitely don't be shy about sending any of the feedback in. You might have noticed throughout this webinar, and also as you're navigating Intacct in the new UI, that there are some things that are not ready yet. So pages that have not been converted will display a new look coming soon wording, so that you know they are planning on getting that updated. They have not released any updates in the beta for consolidations, platform services, timesheet entry, or select bills to pay, and that's because they've got the new AP workbench, so they know that those have not been updated yet. They also gave us a caution that some third-party integrations might not work, and that some dialog boxes and field section help dialogues can't be dragged around. They can only be opened and closed. And then they're still working on the ability to easily view and sort attachments. So those are known open items that they are working on. If you encounter anything else, encounter any bugs, anything like that, definitely go ahead and report those. And for those of you that have not heard any other communications from Intacct, I will let you know that they are going to force you to use the beta starting sometime in Q1 next year. But for right now, you have the option to opt in and switch back and forth between the two. So just FYI, it is coming. So make sure that you're starting to use it now so you are not so surprised when it changes in the middle of your year-end close. Okay, so in conclusion, today we've covered all of the updates in Release 3 for contracts, projects, accounts receivable, inventory, workflow and ease of use updates, reporting, the Salesforce integration version 2, and the other workflow enhancements. At this time, we will take questions. Megan, I believe you have that list.
I do, and of course, like Brenda mentioned earlier, if anyone has any additional questions, you're welcome to submit them at this time. We do have a few here, so I'm going to go through those first, but we do have a little bit of time before the top of the hour, so we can definitely get in additional questions if you'd like to. So Brenda, I think that actually several of these are from your sections throughout the webinar, so I'll direct them mostly towards you, and then Manesh, you're welcome to weigh in as well. So Brenda, the first one we have up is, when would someone want to use the AP workbench instead of select bills to pay?
Oh, that's a great question. It's probably a little bit overkill for a lot of entities because you probably a lot of smaller organizations only have one AP person. You're doing, one check run a week, and it's not that high a volume. But I would say you definitely want to use the AP workbench in two instances. If you have multiple AP people doing check runs, kind of either in different places or at different times or for different things, if you've got that need there, or if you have a lot of credits. If you're a kind of organization where you get a lot of AP credits that you need to apply on your bills to reduce what you pay, definitely using the AP workbench, as I mentioned, makes it much easier to apply those credits.
Thanks, Brenda. The next one is from the Sage Intacct side. Have you heard, are there any plans to allow employee users to create POs and vendor invoices in the future?
So I haven't heard anything about that in terms of the roadmap, but my guess would be no. And the reason why is those are both posting transactions, and employee users is a read-only license with limited approval functionality. So you're allowed to create sales orders and purchase requests, and you're allowed to create, timesheets and expense reports and approve all of those items as well. So if they do allow that in the future, I would be really surprised.
Perfect. And sorry, Manesh, but the last one is for Brenda as well.
No problem, Brenda.
So
winner.
This one is, I'm not familiar with forecasting reports in Sage Intacct. Can you expand on what those are?
Well, this might actually be a better Manesh question as he's our reporting expert. But what a forecasting report is in Intacct, it allows you to have several different kinds of columns on your financial reports. You can have budget columns, you can have actual columns, and it also allows you to have a forecast column. And what that forecast column does is take your forecasted budget either after this current month or now partially in the middle of the month and say, okay, here's my actuals to date, and then here's my budget for the rest of the year. Is there anything else that you would add to that, Manesh?
No, that was very well said. Yeah, forecast in Intacct is pretty much just a revised budget for the future. So if you're already utilizing or you're entering your budget for the year And, part of doing that, right, if I have a board approved budget at the beginning of the year and it's going to go in and extend through, most of our clients will budget by the month, so 12 months in the year, then you can do analyses off of the forecasted budget. So exactly as Brenda mentioned on those columns, you'll actually see a little toggle to grab that forecast, or you could even grab the same budget, change the name to it, and change the period as well. So lots of flexibility there. It's very basic. It's not going to be a smart forecast that goes in and looks at some of the information and says, okay, we need to go and update this. That budget itself that you load is mass updatable in Intacct as well. So if you've loaded a budget for the first part of the year and then you've went through a quarter and you're like, well, my forecast changed because I went through this, this, and this amount of growth, then you can go in and revise those entries for the future. So well said, Brenda. Nothing more beyond that to add.
Well, thank you to both you, Brenda, and you, Manesh, for sharing all this awesome information today. As we mentioned, we will be sending out a PDF of the slides for everyone, as well as an on-demand recording of the webinar within just a few days here. So definitely keep an eye out for that if you want to check out the webinar again or revisit any of the things that Brenda and Manesh covered today. Of course, you're always welcome to contact them directly. Their contact info is up on the screen for those of you who don't already know them personally. But we will, like I said, we'll send it out so you'll have it in your inbox as well. And with that, thank you for everyone for joining us today. Thanks so much.
Have a great day.